The Kelver and corridor had been silent. For 19 days, not peaceful silent there. Is a difference, 200 hegemony warships sat on one side of the trade lane and 160 Dominion battle cruisers sat on the other. Neither side had fired, neither side had moved. They were waiting for the other to make a mistake, and so far neither had. Gra stood at the center of his command deck and looked at the long wall of Dominion ships on his display. He had done this every morning for 19 days. He was beginning to find it boring. His second officer, a younger reptilian named Peak, kept his eyes on the sensor feeds and said nothing. That was the kind of discipline Gra liked. On the Dominion side, Commander Vaughn sat in his chair with his long fingers pressed together and his pale eyes half closed. He was not bored, he was thinking. He was always thinking. His fleet had fewer ships but better ones, and he had spent 19 days running calculations about when Gra would lose patience. He believed it would be soon. Neither of them was thinking about humans. That changed at 600 corridor time when a single ship dropped out of faster than light traveled directly between the two fleets. It appeared without warning, no approach signal, no identification broadcast. It simply arrived, hanging in the space between two of the most powerful military forces in the known galaxy, and it sat there like it had every right to be exactly where it was. Peak looked at his sensors twice before he said anything. Then he said, "Commander, there is a vessel between us and the Dominion line." Gra turned. "Dominion scout?" "No, sir." Peak paused. "It is human." Gra stared at him. Then he looked at the display. The ship was small by galactic standards. It was tiny, roughly the size of a hegemony light escort. Though its shape was unusual, it had clearly been repaired more than once. There were sections of the hull where the plating did not quite match. It had weapons, but nothing that would concern even a single hegemony destroyer, let alone 200 of them, across the corridor. Vaughn had gone very still. "What is a human vessel doing here?" his tactical officer asked. Vaughn did not answer. He was watching the ship with the same careful attention he gave to everything he did not yet understand. Aboard the human vessel, unyielding, the crew had already seen both fleets. They had seen them before they dropped out of FTL because Captain Rail had made sure of it. He had spent 40 minutes studying the sensor data during approach. He knew the fleet positions, the rough weapons loadouts on the visible ships, and the approximate distance between the two lines. He had then poured himself a cup of water, drank it, and told his helmsman to bring them in. Sierra was standing near the back of the bridge. When they arrived, she was an Accord observer assigned to human space for 3 years to study the species and report back to the Galactic Accord on their development. She had traveled aboard the Unyielding for 6 weeks. She had found the humans to be strange and frequently confusing. She had not found them to be suicidal until now. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could, "there are approximately 360 warships in this corridor." 3602, said Dova, the tactical officer, without looking up from her console. 2 of the Dominion ships were behind a debris field on the initial scan. They are visible now. Sierra looked at Dova, then she looked at Rail. Rail was watching the display with calm, dark eyes. He was not a large man. He was not particularly impressive to look at. He had the kind of face that suggested he had seen difficult things and had simply continued anyway. He glanced at Sura briefly, then looked back at the display. Open a channel, he said, both fleets. His communications officer, a quiet young man named Breck, opened the channel without hesitation. Rail spoke clearly and without any particular urgency. He identified his ship and his name. He stated that the Unyielding was a registered vessel operating under human authority and that it intended to transit the Kelverin corridor on a course to the Selvin trade hub. He stated that this was a legal and standard transit route under accord navigation law. He did not ask for permission. He informed them that he was passing through. Then he nodded to Breck, who closed the channel. Sir realized she had forgotten to breathe. You did not ask, she said. No, Rail agreed. You told them. Yes. Sierra looked at the 362 warships on the display. Captain, I must formally note that this is noted, said Rail. He told his helmsman to begin the transit course straight through, right down the middle. On the hegemony command deck, Gra looked at the ship moving calmly between his fleet and the Dominion line. He looked at it for a long moment, then something happened that had not happened in 19 days of tense silence. He laughed. His officers laughed too. A human ship, one human ship, announcing it was passing through as though it were a river ferry, and they were a minor inconvenience on the water. Vaughn did not laugh. He watched the ship moving and said nothing. Gra straightened up, still smiling, and gave a short order. Single hegemony destroyer fired a warning shot. The energy burst crossed the Unyielding's bow close enough to register on every sensor aboard. A clear message, a universal language. Turn around. On the Unyielding's bridge, the shot lit up the displays in sharp orange. Rail looked at it. He looked at the data for exactly 3 seconds. Then he told the helmsman to maintain course and speed. Sierra stared at him. Dova glanced up from her console with a small expression that was almost a smile. Tin's voice came up from engineering over the intercom, calm and unhurried, saying the shields had registered the shot and were fine. The Unyielding kept moving, and somewhere across the corridor, Vaughn leaned forward in his chair just slightly and began to pay very close attention. The second shot was not a warning. Gra had decided that the first shot was generous. He was not a generous commander by nature, and watching a single human ship continue its course after a clear warning had moved him past amusement and into something colder. He did not raise his voice when he gave the order. He simply told his destroyer captain to fire a disabling shot, direct hit, and stop the vessel. The shot struck the Unyielding on its port flank. The bridge shook. Lights dropped for 2 seconds before backup systems caught them. Sierra grabbed the edge of a console and held on. Several displays flickered and reset. From somewhere deep in the ship came a sound like metal complaining under pressure, a long groan that passed and then faded. Tin's voice came over the intercom almost immediately. He did not sound panicked. He sounded the way a person sounds when they find an unexpected problem and are already solving it. He said the port shield emitter had taken the hit directly, that 2 power relays were damaged, and that he was already rerouting. He said it the way someone might report that a pipe was leaking and they had a wrench in hand. Dova had not flinched during the hit. Her hands were moving across her console with quiet efficiency. She was not, Sierra noticed, doing anything that Looked like damage control, she was. Running numbers, she was running. Targeting solutions. On every hegemony ship in range, you are targeting them, SRA said, her voice came out more controlled than she expected. Standard precaution, Dova said. There are 200 ships, 201. There's a small vessel running quiet on the far edge of their formation. Probably a command relay ship. She tilted her head slightly. Actually that one first if it comes to it. Sierra turned to Rail. He was standing at the center of the bridge, hands at his sides, watching the damage reports scroll across his main display. His face had not changed. He looked like a man reading a list of errands. Captain Sierra said, they have fired on us directly. I must advise immediate withdrawal and a formal accord complaint filed through. Bria said, channel open. Bree said. Rail looked at the display showing Gra's flagship. He spoke in the same level tone he had used before, with no anger in it and no fear. He said that the Unyielding was a registered vessel on a legal transit course. He said that it had now been fired upon twice. He said clearly and without emphasis that if the hegemony fired again, the Unyielding would treat it as a declared act of war and respond accordingly. Then he added one more thing. He said, this is your one warning. We do not give two. He nodded to Breck. Channel closed on the hegemony command deck. Gra stared at the comm screen for a moment after it went dark. Then he looked at Peak. PC looked back at him with the careful expression of an officer who has learned not to show what he is thinking. One warning greeted. Yes, Commander. Gra looked at the display showing the Unyielding still moving, still on course. One shield emitter damaged and absolutely not stopping. A human ship had just told him, Gra, fleet commander of the 7th Hegemony Arm, that it was giving him a warning, one as though he were a minor obstacle. He found this offensive. Across the corridor, Vaughn had watched the exchange with his full attention. His tactical officer had run a quiet analysis of the Unyielding specs and put the results on screen. Single vessel. Crew estimate between 12 and 20. Weapons load appropriate for a mid-range patrol craft. Nothing that should concern a fleet, and yet Vaughn had given an order 10 minutes ago that his fleet had not yet questioned. Hold position, do not engage, observe. His second officer, a tall woman named Kale, asked him quietly. Why? Vaughn said, because it has not stopped. Kale looked at the Unyielding on her screen. It is one ship. Commander. Yes, Vaughn said, and it was hit and it did not stop, and now it is giving warnings to a fleet of 200. He paused. I want to know what it does next. What it did next surprised everyone. Graded 3 destroyers to move into intercept positions, a standard flanking approach designed to box in a smaller vessel and force it to halt. The ships moved smoothly into position, cutting off the Unyielding's forward path. The Unyielding did not halt. It changed its drive signature. Tin had done something to the ships engines that Sierra could not follow technically, but the result was visible. On every sensor in the corridor, the Unyielding's drive output became irregular, shifting in short bursts, making its exact position and momentum difficult to calculate. It was not fast enough to outrun the destroyers, but it was suddenly very difficult to predict. The 3 destroyers adjusted, then adjusted again. Their intercept solutions kept needing correction. Dova watched this with visible Satisfaction. They are recalculating, she said. How long can Tin keep that up? Rail asked. He says 20 minutes before the drive. Coils need to cool, but he also says he has another idea after that, and I have stopped asking him to explain his ideas because they make my head hurt. Rail almost smiled. Almost. Sierra stood in the middle of the bridge and looked at the 3 destroyers struggling to box in one damaged human ship that was making itself difficult to catch through what appeared to be creative mechanical improvisation. And she had a feeling, quiet and unsettling, that she had been observing humans for 3 years and had understood almost nothing about them. Gra gave a new order, all 3 destroyers full weapons free. Rail heard the weapons locks register on his display. He looked at Dova. She was already moving. Dova did not fire back the way anyone expected. The 3 hegemony destroyers had weapons locked. Every tactical mind watching Gra, analyst on every ship in the corridor, expected one of 2 responses. Either the unyielding would try to run, or it would fire everything it had in a desperate attempt to punch through. It did neither. Dova fired 3 precise shots, 1 at each destroyer, but not at their holes, not at their engines, and not at anything that would destroy them. She hit their targeting arrays. Each shot was narrow, fast, and surgical, aimed at the specific antenna clusters that fed weapons lock data to the destroyers' fire control systems. All 3 destroyers lost their locks simultaneously. The hegemony gunners scrambled to reacquire. By the time they did, the unyielding had slipped between 2 of them, close enough that firing on it would risk hitting the other destroyer. It was now inside their formation. On the hegemony command deck, PC said nothing. He was watching the tactical display with an expression that had gone very careful and very quiet. Gra said loudly to bring more ships in. Dova was already watching them come. She had in the last 4 minutes built a detailed picture of how the hegemony formation communicated. The relay ship Vaughn had noticed earlier, the quiet one running low power on the edge of the formation, was the same ship Dova had flagged when Sierra accused her of targeting everything. It was a command relay node. It was the ship that fed coordination signals between the destroyers and the main fleet. She looked at Rail. He gave her a small nod. She disabled it with a single shot. The effect was not immediate destruction. The hegemony ships did not stop functioning, but they stopped coordinating cleanly. The tight formation signals that told each captain what every other captain was doing went from instant to delayed, small delays, a few seconds each. But when you were trying to box in a ship that moved in unpredictable bursts, a few seconds was enough for everything to go wrong. 4 more destroyers came in. They came from different angles, which was the right tactical decision, but their timing was off by just enough that the unyielding could treat them as separate problems rather than one combined one. Tin Deep in the engine room had moved on from his first idea to his second. He had taken the unyielding secondary maneuvering thrusters, small jets designed for docking and slow repositioning, and he had reconfigured them to fire in short, sharp bursts alongside the main drive. The result was that the ship could twitch sideways in ways that its size and mass should not have allowed. It was not elegant. It made a sound like the ship was arguing with itself, but it worked. Sierra had stopped trying to advise Rail to withdraw. She was watching Dova work with an expression she could not quite name. She is not trying to win, SRA said quietly, more to herself than anyone. Rael heard her. No, he said, then what is she doing? Rael watched the display. 7 destroyers failing to contain one ship. A relay no dark coordination signals. Degraded, he said, she is making it. Expensive. Sierra thought about that. Expensive. She repeated, every ship they send has to stop what it was doing. Every minute they spend on us is a minute they are not watching the Dominion line. Every shot they fire at us is a shot that might hit their own ships if their timing is off. He glanced at her. We do not need to destroy anyone. We need to make the cost of stopping us higher than the cost of letting us pass. Sierra stared at him. That is the plan. That is the entire plan. It is a very good plan, Dova said, not looking up. Across the corridor, Vaughn had pulled his fleet back 200 km, not retreating. Repositioning, he wanted a cleaner view. And he did not want to be accidentally drawn into something while he was still thinking. Kale stood beside him and said quietly that the humans were doing something she had never seen before. Vor said he knew. She asked what it was. Called. Vaughn thought for a moment. He had studied many species' military histories. He had read Accord databases on conflict patterns going back several thousand years. He said in very old human military writing they call it attrition by frustration. You do not overpower the enemy. You make fighting you so difficult, so costly, so irritating that continuing becomes irrational. Kale looked at the 7 destroyers, still failing to pin down one damaged ship. Is it working? Vaughn watched the display. The hegemony formation had pulled 12 ships away from its main line to deal with the situation. 12 ships that were no longer watching his fleet. He said, yes, and I do not think Gra has noticed what he has already given away. On the unyielding, a console sparked near the back of the bridge. Tin's sideways thruster trick was putting stress on the ship's frame that it was not designed for. Small stress, manageable stress, but it was accumulating. Rael looked at the damage report and then at Dova. How much longer? Dova pulled up a quiet calculation. She said Gra had 4 options left if he wanted to stop them without risking his own ships hitting each other, and 3 of those options required him to be patient. She said Gra did not look like a patient commander. He will try something big soon. She said something all at once. Rael said, good. Sir looked at him sharply. Good when he tries something big. Rael said he will have to commit, and when he commits he stops being unpredictable. He watched the display. Predictable I can work with. Sir looked at the human captain standing calmly in the middle of a battle he had started on purpose against 200 ships, talking about the enemy becoming predictable as though it were a minor convenience, and she had the sudden, clear thought that she had made a very serious error in her 3-year assessment report. She had written that humans were an emotional species prone to poor decision-making under pressure. She was going to need to rewrite that section. The Accord relay station at the edge of the Kelverin system was not staffed by anyone important. It was a small automated post, 3 technicians on rotation, mostly there to log traffic and forward reports. None of them had expected to spend their shift watching a live tactical feed of one human vessel refusing to be stopped by a hegemony fleet, but that is what they were doing. And they were not alone. Automated beacons along the corridor had been broadcasting position data since the fight started. Smugglers, traders, and independent pilots who used the corridor as a regular route were all receiving the same feed. Word moved fast. In the outer lanes, within 2 hours of the Unyielding's first arrival, the incident had spread to 16 different relay networks, 4 independent news sources, and the personal comms of at least 3 senior Accord officials who were not supposed to be monitoring unofficial feeds but very much were. In the Accord Central Chamber, an analyst named F pulled together everything available on humanity and put it on a single display. What she found was thin, embarrassingly thin, a species with one inhabited world, limited FTL capability, no formal military alliance, and a grand total of 9 registered vessels in Accord space. Their last formal assessment had been filed 2 years ago. It described them as pre-integration, low threat, and unlikely to be relevant to galactic affairs for at least another generation. F stared at that file for a long moment. Then she started a new one. Back in the corridor, SRA had started asking questions. Not formal observer questions, not the careful, categorized questions she had been trained to ask. Real questions, the kind that come when something cracks the frame you have built around a subject, and you have to look at it differently. She found Rail at a secondary display near the back of the bridge during a brief lull when the hegemony ships were regrouping and Dova was running quiet maintenance on her targeting systems. She asked him something she had been circling for weeks. She asked why humans never waited. Rail looked at her. He asked what she meant. She said she had observed 9 different space-faring species in her career. Every one of them, when faced with a situation they were not prepared for, would stop in, gather more information, build a better plan, wait for more resources. Humans did not do this. She had watched them. For 3 years, they walked into things. They started without enough. They improvised badly and then kept going. She said she had written this down as a flaw. Rail was quiet for a moment. Then he said, where we come from, waiting often meant dying. Sir watched him. He said Earth was not a forgiving place. Not historically, not in the long, deep history, before space, before technology, before any of the things that made a civilization. Humans had lived through ice and drought and disease and things eating them in the dark. Every generation had faced something that should have ended them. None of those generations had the option of waiting for better conditions. He said it got into us deep, the part that says go now, figure it out as you go, because if you wait for perfect, you will wait until you are dead. Sierra thought of the assessment file she had written. She had called this impulsiveness. You call it something else, she said. It was not quite a question. Rail said we call it Tuesday. Dova from across the bridge said she was picking up hegemony ships reorganizing into a new formation. She said it looked like Gra had finally decided to stop being clever and was preparing a masked approach. All available ships direct line, overwhelming force. Rail straightened up and moved back to the center of the bridge. Sir followed because she had nowhere else to go, and if she was being honest, because she did not want to miss what happened next. Vaughn had reached the same conclusion as Dova about 15 minutes earlier. He had watched Gra pull ships from the perimeter and push them toward the Center, he had done the math, a masked approach on the unyielding would put most of the hegemony's active formation in a tight cluster, all facing in one direction, all facing away from him. Kale noticed this at the same time he did. She looked at him and said nothing. Waiting. Vaughn pressed his long fingers together and thought very carefully. He was not an impulsive commander. He did not move without understanding the consequences. He spent 12 minutes in silence while his fleet held position, and Gra continued reorganizing. At the end of those 12 minutes, Vaughn said, when Gra commits his formation to the human vessel, he will expose his left flank. I want our ship's position to hold that flank, not to attack it, to hold it. Kale said, you are protecting the human ship. Vaughn said, I am ensuring that if this escalates, it does not escalate on terms that favor Gra. Said, that is the same thing, Commander. Vaughn looked at her, then he said, yes, I suppose it is. Tin came up from engineering at that point. He was a short man with grease on his forearms and the look of someone who had been solving impossible problems for so long he had started to enjoy them. He told Rail that he had an idea about the forward shield emitter, the one damaged in the second hit. He said with about 40 minutes of work during a lull, he could not fully repair it, but he could do something more interesting than repair it. Rail asked what Tin said. He could make it emit a feedback pulse on the same frequency the hegemony destroyers used for targeting lock, not powerful enough to destroy anything, but enough to make any ship trying to lock onto the unyielding feel like it was trying to hold something that kept slipping. Rail looked at Dova. Dova looked at Tin. She asked how he had figured that out. Tin said he had read the technical specs for hegemony targeting systems in the Accord database 3 years ago out of boredom, and had been wondering ever since if something like this would work. Dova said, go do it. Tin went back downstairs. Sierra looked around the bridge at Rail, watching the incoming formation with calm eyes, at Dova already building new firing solutions, at Breck quietly logging every exchange in precise detail, at the display showing Vaughn's fleet quietly shifting into a position that would protect them whether they had asked for protection or not. She thought about the assessment she had to file. When this was over, she thought about the word irrelevant. She decided she was going to need a much longer document. Gra sent 40 ships, not 200, not all of them. 40 because 40 should have been more than enough, and because sending all 200 would have meant admitting this was a real problem. In Gra's experience, real problems were things that happened to other commanders. He was going to resolve this quickly and get back to the standoff. The 40 ships moved in a wide arc, textbook encirclement pattern designed to leave no exit, every angle covered, every direction blocked, overlapping fields of fire, any vessel caught inside. It had two options, surrender or be destroyed. Tin finished his work on the shield emitter with 4 minutes to spare. The 40 ships began their approach, and then from the Dominion side of the corridor, 16 warships moved quietly into positions along the hegemony's left flank. Not threatening, not weapons hot, just their blocking. Vaughn's ships had placed themselves like a wall between Gra's main formation and the space behind it. Gra noticed. He opened a channel to Vaughn and demanded an explanation. Vaughn said very calmly that the Dominion fleet was repositioning for navigational reasons and that it had Nothing to do with the hegemonies. Current engagement. He then closed the channel and Kale made a quiet sound. Beside him, that was not quite a laugh. Gra had a choice, deal with Vaughn or deal with the human ship. He could not do both at once without splitting his attention. He split his attention. This was his second major mistake of the day. The encirclement closed. Inside it, the unyielding did the last thing anyone expected. It stopped trying to move through and started moving between. Rail told his helmsman to use the hegemony ships themselves as cover. The unyielding tucked in close, uncomfortably close to destroyer on its port side, close enough that the ships on the other side of the formation could not fire without risk of hitting their own vessel. Then it moved to the next one, then the next, threading through the formation like a needle through fabric, always with a hegemony hull between itself and the cleanest firing angle. This required two things: precise piloting and very good prediction of where the enemy ships would move. Breck had been quietly running a pattern analysis on hegemony formation movements. Since the fight began, he had 3 hours of data. He passed it to the helmsman. Real time. Small adjustments, nudges. Quiet voice saying, love 2 degrees. Hold forward now right. And the helmsman, a young woman named Pav, who had never been in a combat situation before today, flew it perfectly. Tins. Feedback pulse came online. The targeting locks on the 40 encircling ships began slipping, not all of them. Not completely, but enough that every weapon solution needed constant recalculation. Gunners who had been certain of their shot found themselves uncertain. Officers who had trained on clean engagements against ships that behaved predictably had no good answer for a vessel that seemed to resist being held. In a targeting system, Dova, meanwhile, was not idle. She had identified the 6 ships in the formation that carried the most tactical weight, the ones whose loss would cause the most disruption to coordination and communication. She worked through them methodically, not destroying, disabling, a shot to the sensor array here, a shot to the drive. Coupling there, precise, fast, one at a time, always time for the moment when the target ship was briefly exposed and not screened by another. The formation began to come apart at the edges. Gra was watching his tactical display and seeing something he had not experienced in 20 years of command, a situation that was not responding to standard solutions. He added more ships to the encirclement. The encirclement got messier, not tighter. He ordered increased fire. The increased fire mostly hit the spaces the unyielding had just been. He redirected his command relay signals. 3 of his relay points were already dark, disabled by DOVA. In the early minutes of the fight, Peak, standing beside him and saying nothing, was beginning to look the way officers look when they understand that something has gone wrong at a level that cannot be fixed by adding more force. On the Dominion side, Vaughn had called his senior officers together around his tactical table. He was explaining quietly and clearly what he was watching. He said the human vessel was not simply fighting, it was demonstrating something. Every move it made was the most efficient possible use of a single small ship against a large formation. It was not fighting with the logic of a species that expected to win individual battles. It was fighting with the logic of a species that had spent its entire history being outmatched and had developed an entire philosophy around still winning, anyway. One of his officers, a young male named Bree, asked if that was really true. He said it sounded like a story people told about humans to make them seem interesting. Vaughn pulled up the data on his table. 3 hours of engagement, 40 ships committed to stopping 1, 19 disabled or pulled out of position, 0 human casualties reported. He let Brest look at it. Brest looked at it for a while. Then he stopped asking questions. Gra hailed Rail. He did not do it loudly. He did it on a private channel. No fleet broadcast, just the 2 ships. He said, and the effort it cost him was audible, that the hegemony was prepared to discuss terms. Rail said, I am listening. Gra said he wanted the unyielding to stop disabling his ships. Rail said the unyielding would stop disabling hegemony ships. When the hegemony stopped trying to disable the unyielding, he said both fleets would stand down. He said the corridor would remain open. He said no vessel, military or civilian, any species would be fired on in this lane without formal declaration and accord notification. There was a pause on Gra's end, a long one. Gra agreed. Rail nodded to Dova. She pulled her hands back from her console. Tin powered down the feedback pulse. Pav eased the unyielding back to open space and held it there, steady. Waiting, Gra cut the channel. In the silence that followed, Gra turned to Peak. He asked very quietly how he was supposed to explain this to the High Council. Peak thought about it carefully. He said, I would recommend not mentioning how many ships were involved. Commander Gra said nothing. He looked at the unyielding on the display, small, damaged in 3 places. 1 shield emitter still partially compromised, sitting calmly in the middle of the corridor. It had just fought its way through. He said nothing. For a very long time, the Accord convened its emergency session 4 days. After the corridor went quiet, it was not a small meeting. 42 member species sent representatives. Some of them were there because they had been asked. Several were there because they had seen the relay feed from the corridor and had decided that certain conversations could no longer be postponed. The chamber was full and unusually quiet, which told anyone familiar with the Accord that the subject being discussed was one that made people careful about what they said out loud. The session chair opened with a summary of the Kellen incident. She was factual and brief. 1 human vessel, 362 ships belonging to 2 major powers. Duration of engagement, 4 hours and 17 minutes. Hegemony ships disabled or pulled from position. 23 human casualties, none. Hegemony casualties, none. Outcome, a ceasefire negotiated by the human captain, still in effect. Corridor open to all transit traffic. She paused after reading that last line to let it exist in the room for a moment. The debate that followed was long and in places heated. Several representatives from species with long-standing hegemony ties argued that the incident had been reckless, that the human captain had provoked a conflict unnecessarily, that the correct response was a formal reprimand. A Dominion-aligned representative pointed out very calmly that the corridor had been closed for 19 days before the human ship arrived and open ever since. He said he was not sure what a reprimand was supposed to accomplish. A representative from the Mavari, small species that had never been particularly influential in Accord politics but were known for saying uncomfortable things clearly, stood up and said the real question was not what the human captain had done wrong. The real question was what the Accord had done wrong by failing to understand humanity for this long. The room got quieter. SRA delivered her testimony on the second day. She had spent the 4 days since the corridor sitting in the unyielding small common area writing. She had not slept much. What she produced was not a standard Accord Observer report. It was 63 pages, and it began with a line that was quoted in every major political broadcast across 12 systems within a week of its release. The line read, "I spent 3 years studying humans and wrote a report that was factually accurate and completely wrong." She stood in the chamber and did not use notes. She said the Accord had been measuring humanity against a standard that assumed all spacefaring species valued the same things: stability, accumulation, long planning horizons, and the avoidance of unnecessary conflict. She said humanity valued these things too, but they valued something else more, something that the Accord's assessments had no category for, because no previous species had demonstrated it so clearly. She said the word was persistence, not the regular persistence of a species that keeps trying until it finds a solution, a different kind. The kind that comes from a planet that spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything that lived on it, and everything that lived on it decided to keep living anyway. The kind that gets passed down so deep into a species that it stops being a choice and starts being a reflex. She said a human does not decide to keep going when things are difficult. They have to actively decide to stop. Stopping is the unnatural act. Continuing is the default, she said. This was not a military threat, she said. It was something the Accord had no framework for, and that was the actual problem. The chamber was silent for a long time. After she finished, on the 4th day, Vaughn sent a private communication to the registered human diplomatic contact, a small office in an Accord border station with 2 staff members who had spent the last 4 days handling more incoming messages than they had received. In the previous 4 years, the message was short. It said the Dominion was interested in opening a formal dialogue with humanity at a time and place of humanity's choosing, with no preconditions. The staff member who received it, a tired young man named Paul, read it 3 times, then he forwarded it to his supervisor with a note that said, "I think we need more people aboard the unyielding. Repairs were underway. Had been working for 3 days and showed no sign of stopping. He had fixed the port shield emitter, corrected the stress damage from his own thruster modifications, replaced 2 power relays, and was currently rebuilding something in the secondary drive system that he claimed would make the irregular burst pattern more reliable and less painful for the ship's frame. He was doing this while eating, which Sierra found slightly alarming. Dova was at her console reviewing the engagement data with the focused interest of someone who had genuinely enjoyed a difficult puzzle. She had found 4 moments where she believed she could have done something better, and she was writing them down, not because anyone had asked her to, because she wanted to know. Bree had filed a complete and precise log of every communication from the engagement. He had also quietly filed a copy with the Accord relay station because he believed the record should exist somewhere official. He did this without being asked. Rail found out 3 days later, and said nothing except that Breck had good instincts. Sierra found Rail at the viewport in the late hours of the fourth night. The corridor was quiet outside. Other ships were moving through it now, traders and small transports, carefully, as if they were not quite sure yet that it was safe, but they were moving. She stood beside him and looked at the same thing he was looking at. She asked him if humanity understood what had changed. He thought about it. He said he was not sure. He said humans were not very good at recognizing when something large had shifted. They tended to notice the individual problems in front of them and deal with those and only look up afterward. SRA said, "The Accord is afraid of you." Now, Rail said, "Good. Fear is easier to work with than dismissal." She looked at him. She asked if that was always how it had been, if humans had always had to frighten people before they were taken seriously. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "Yes, pretty much," but he said they were working on it. Sir looked at the ships moving slowly through the open corridor and thought about 63 pages of testimony, and a small diplomatic office suddenly flooded with messages, and a Dominion commander who had repositioned his fleet to protect a ship that had not asked for help, and a hegemony fleet commander who had agreed to terms with a vessel a fraction of his size. She thought about the word irrelevant. In a quiet office in Accord Central, senior official named Dree read a newly filed intelligence document to its last page. It had a long title, the summary. At the bottom was short. It said that the previous threat classification for humanity was no longer appropriate and recommended immediate reclassification to Tier 1 pending review. Dree sat the document down on his desk. He looked at it for a moment. He had been in Accord politics for 30 years. He had watched many species be discovered, assessed, dismissed, and forgotten. He had signed the original human assessment file himself, the one that said unlikely to be relevant for another generation. He looked at the document a while longer, then he said very quietly to the empty room, "We